explicit and implicit transactions are two ways to kind of skin the same cat. There's a number of different ways to get to the same place, number of ways to do the same thing. And with transactions, that is certainly the case. Now, SQL Server 2012 has 3 modes for user transactions. The first one's auto commit. And if you've noticed, we're doing insert, update, and delete statements all over the place here, but I have never mentioned a transaction. Why? Because auto commit takes care of that. Single data modifications are executed in the context of a transaction. Automatically committed when they're successful, they're rolled back if the statement fails. No big deal, it just happens for me. But here's where it gets kind of interesting. We can choose to use implicit transactions in our database, and that means every command that is issued automatically starts a transaction, but that transaction does not automatically commit or roll back. I must explicitly commit or roll back the transaction. So I have to execute a commit statement or a rollback statement to finish that transaction. If I commit it, the changes will eventually be written into the database. If I roll them back, the changes are just going to be erased and they never happen. Now also keep in mind, SQL Server uses what's called a transaction log table. And when I make changes to the database, those changes are actually only written into the transaction log, so that if I roll them back, I can just delete them out of the transaction log and it's like they never happened. If I commit them, I mark them as committed into the transaction log, and a little bit later on, they will be written into the database itself as changes. Now, the third option here is explicit transaction. And this is where the programmer has to explicitly use the programming terms begin transaction to start the transaction and then issue a commit transaction or rollback transaction command to end the transaction. Now, this is a question that's been on the exam for years. It's still there. You could see it. If you get this group of questions where this one's in it, you're going to see this one. What happens? Sally says that she made a bunch of changes to the database, but 4 days later, none of those changes are there. But she knows she made them. Where did they go? Well, implicit transactions may have been enabled on that database for some reason. And so she made a bunch of changes to the database, but no commit or rollback statement was ever issued. And so her data just kind of lived out there in the transaction log. And at some point there, the database server got restarted. Well, remember the aspect of transactions that says we leave the database in a consistent state? We had transactions out there in the transaction log that were never committed. They were never rolled back. When the server started up and it saw those, it said, wait a minute, here's some stuff that was never committed or rolled back. I'm just going to erase it. I don't know what this is about, but I've got to get the database back to a stable, consistent state. And so all of Sally's changes got wiped out because they were never committed or rolled back. So you need to watch for that. If changes made to the database disappear after a database restart, then implicit transaction is probably enabled, and you need to go back in and turn that off, or you need to start coding these commits and rollbacks on everything that's done. Now, that's pretty much the bottom line on implicit and explicit transactions, and I'm going to show you how you can use explicit transactions to your major benefit when we look at some locking and transaction examples a little bit later on in the course. That's actually coming up in the next couple of videos, so keep an eye on that. So watch for the question on implicit transactions. Just make sure you understand the difference between implicit and explicit.